What happens when a wealthy businessman mocks a quiet stranger in first class, only to realize too late that he's been insulting a legend? This flight will change everything. Watch till the end for the shocking twist. Like and subscribe for more incredible stories. The Fateful Encounter, Los Angeles International Airport. The chaos begins. Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, was a battlefield of movement. People rushed in every direction, their footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. Rolling suitcases clattered against polished floors. Flight announcements blared over the intercom, and weary travelers darted from one terminal to the next. David Carter stood in the midst of the commotion, but he was untouched by the chaos. He had long since mastered the art of appearing important. Standing with an air of authority, his suit crisp, his posture impeccable, his Rolex subtly displayed under the tailored sleeve of his jacket. As he stood in the first-class check-in line, he glanced at the people around him, as he often did, assessing them. CEOs, executives, elite travelers, his kind of people. But then someone stood out. A man stood a few spots ahead of him in the line, completely out of place. David's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the worn-out flannel shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed-up boots. The man carried an old black backpack, slung over one shoulder, looking like it had seen more miles than most people in this terminal combined. He stood relaxed, almost too comfortable, as if he didn't care about the luxurious atmosphere around him. David instinctively disliked him. It wasn't just the clothes, it was the attitude. People who flew first class usually acted like they belonged. They carried expensive luggage, wore designer brands, and exuded a certain confidence that came with wealth. This guy? He didn't have that. He wasn't gawking in awe at the expensive surroundings like someone experiencing luxury for the first time, but he also wasn't trying to prove himself. That irritated David. He folded his arms and scoffed under his breath. This guy must have used all his savings just to afford this one first-class ticket. Or maybe he got a free upgrade. People like him don't belong here. And that's when he couldn't resist. The first dig, a challenge, begins. David leaned forward slightly, making sure his voice was just loud enough for the man to hear. "First class, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't realize they were handing out free upgrades today." The man turned his head and looked at him. David expected a flustered reaction, maybe a nervous laugh, an awkward explanation, something that would confirm what he already believed. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he held David's gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable, calm, as if he'd heard this 1,000 times before. Then with a slight shrug, he replied, "The world is full of surprises." That response caught David off guard. No defensiveness, no arrogance, no attempt to justify himself, just pure indifference. David forced out a chuckle, masking his slight irritation. "Nothing personal," he continued, his smirk widening, "but you don't exactly look like the kind of guy who flies first class." Again, the man barely reacted. He simply tilted his head slightly as if considering the statement. Looks can be deceiving. David's smirk faltered just a little. Before he could respond, the line moved forward. The airline employee took their tickets without a second glance and waved them toward security. David watched as the man casually walked ahead, completely unbothered by their exchange. That annoyed him more than it should have. Boarding the plane. A nightmare unfolds. By the time David reached his gate, he had already put the interaction behind him. He was about to board a luxurious first-class seat on a long-haul flight. There was no reason to waste another thought on some random guy who happened to be in the wrong place, until he stepped onto the plane. As he walked down the aisle of first class, he checked his boarding pass. Seat 4A, aisle, perfect. Then as he arrived at his row, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The same man from earlier, sliding into seat 4B, right next to him. David froze for a moment. He checked his ticket again. Maybe he was in the wrong row. No, 4A was correct. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. The man glanced up at him and gave a polite, almost amused smile. "Looks like we're travel partners." David exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain calm. He wasn't about to let some random stranger ruin his flight. With a tight-lipped expression, he threw himself into his seat, adjusting his expensive watch as if to reassert his status. He didn't realize it yet, but that seat assignment was no coincidence. This flight, this chance encounter, was about to turn his world upside down. And by the time they landed, David Carter would never see success, power, or status the same way again. The Battle of Egos. A first-class war begins. David Carter leaned back in his plush leather seat, adjusting his posture as if trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the man beside him. He still couldn't believe it. Of all the seats on this plane, why this guy? He stole another glance at him. The same faded flannel shirt, the beaten-up boots, the backpack stuffed under the seat in front of him. The guy sat there calmly, as if he were in a cafe waiting for his coffee instead of flying first class. David let out an irritated sigh and flagged down a flight attendant. "Champagne, please? Something that actually matches the exclusivity of this seat." The flight attendant, used to demanding passengers, nodded with a polite smile and moved to fetch his drink. When she turned to the man next to him, she asked in the same professional tone, "And for you, sir?" The man glanced up and replied casually, "Just water, please." David nearly choked on his own scoff. He turned his head slightly, his smirk returning. "Water?" he asked, letting out a soft chuckle. "In first class. Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience with just water." The man took the bottle handed to him, twisted the cap off, and took a slow sip before responding. "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." David narrowed his eyes slightly. Something about that response irked him. Simplicity? In first class? The whole point of paying thousands of dollars for a ticket was to enjoy things most people couldn't afford. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less," David said, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." The man didn't respond immediately. He just raised his water bottle slightly, as if toasting to the absurdity of the conversation, and took another sip. Passengers around them started to notice. A couple sitting nearby exchanged glances. A businessman a row ahead of them subtly turned his head, pretending to look for something in the overhead compartment. But really, he was listening. David felt it, the tension in the air, the subtle shift in energy. He wasn't just making idle conversation anymore. This was turning into a battle. Who really belongs here? David wasn't going to let this guy get away with acting like he belonged here. He leaned slightly toward him, tilting his head as if examining him closer. "So what do you do for a living?" he asked in a casual tone, though his eyes gleamed with challenge. The man who had been adjusting the straps of his backpack looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." David raised an eyebrow, pretending to be impressed. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Indie projects? Small-time stuff?" The man gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that." David let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "You know, I always find it interesting how people try to find their place. But let's be honest. Certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance." For the first time, the man actually looked at him. Really looked at him. His eyes were calm, but there was something else there too. Something that made David feel like he was the one being evaluated now. "I think we all have our place," the man said finally, "and sometimes it's exactly where we are." David blinked, caught off guard by the confidence in that answer, but he quickly recovered. He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's cute, kind of philosophical even, but real life isn't that simple." The man didn't say anything. He just turned back to the window, letting the conversation die. David didn't like that. He wanted a reaction. "You know," David said, leaning in slightly again, "you might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people." This time the man did react, not with words, but with a look. A look that wasn't anger or irritation, but patience. A kind of quiet understanding. David's stomach twisted slightly, though he wasn't sure why. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. He thought he had the upper hand in this conversation. He didn't realize he was the one being outmatched. The shift, a ticking time bomb. The flight attendants came back through the cabin, offering another round of drinks. David ordered another glass of champagne, making sure to flash his watch a little as he reached for it. The man? Still just water. David smirked. You know, life is a lot like flying first class, he said, swirling his glass again. You work hard, you earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky. The man placed his water bottle down on his tray, turned slightly, and finally engaged fully. Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we? David's smirk faltered just a little. He opened his mouth to fire back, but he couldn't find the words. The passengers around them had completely tuned in now. Even the flight attendants moved a little slower, casting discreet glances toward their row. David let out a short laugh, masking his slight unease. I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here. The man leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. I think the value of being here isn't about what you have, but how you treat others. The words hung in the air like an undeniable truth. David suddenly felt something shift. A couple of passengers nodded subtly. Others exchanged approving glances. For the first time, David felt like he was the outsider, and he hated that feeling. His mind scrambled for a comeback, something to take control of the conversation again. But before he could open his mouth, something happened that changed everything. A flight attendant approached their row and leaned toward the man beside him. Mr. Reeves, the captain wanted me to let you know your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. Also, he sends his best regards. Silence. David froze. His mind replayed what she had just said. Reeves? Keanu Reeves. His throat went dry. His heart pounded. The murmurs started spreading through the cabin. Passengers turned their heads. Some whispered excitedly. David felt his entire world tilt. He had spent this entire flight mocking Keanu Reeves, and now the weight of his mistake came crashing down on him. The collapse. David's fall from grace. The moment everything changed, David Carter's world stopped. He stared blankly at the flight attendant, his brain still processing the name that had just been spoken aloud. Keanu Reeves. Not some random guy, not a struggling indie filmmaker, not someone who didn't belong here, but Keanu freaking Reeves, the legendary actor, the Hollywood icon, the multimillionaire, the man beloved across the world for his humility and kindness. The same man David had been openly mocking for the past hour. The realization hit like a truck. And based on the sudden wave of murmurs spreading through the first-class cabin, he wasn't the only one who just figured it out. Passengers turned their heads, whispering among themselves. Some had already recognized Keanu earlier, but respected his privacy. Others, like David, were only just now realizing the magnitude of their mistake. David's face burned. He felt like he was melting into his seat, the walls of the cabin closing in. Keanu, on the other hand, barely reacted. He simply nodded politely at the flight attendant, offering her a quiet "thank you" before turning his attention back to his water bottle, completely unbothered by the attention now swirling around him. And that made it worse. So much worse. David swallowed hard. He had two options. 1, admit defeat and apologize. 2, dig in deeper and try to save face. And like any man whose ego was crumbling beneath him, he chose wrong. David's desperate attempt to regain control. David forced out a strained chuckle, shaking his head as if the whole situation was just a misunderstanding. I didn't know you were you. Keanu finally looked at him, his expression still neutral. Should that have mattered? David opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Passengers nearby subtly leaned in, sensing the tension, waiting for his next move. He felt trapped, exposed, cornered in a way he had never experienced before. So he did what insecure men do when they lose control. He tried to turn it around. David let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. Well, no offense, man, but you don't exactly dress like a movie star. A few passengers exchanged disapproving glances. A businessman 2 rows ahead let out a quiet scoff. Keanu? Still calm, still completely in control. I don't usually use my name as a calling card, he said simply. And just like that, David felt the final nail hammer into his coffin. He was losing. Worse, he had already lost, and everyone around him knew it. The final blow, Keanu's lesson in humility. David, desperate to claw back even a sliver of dignity, pushed forward. Look, I wasn't trying to be a jerk. You can't blame me for assuming things, right? Come on, you look like a guy who... But Keanu cut him off, not with words, but with a look, a steady, unshakable gaze, the kind that commanded silence without a single syllable spoken. David froze mid-sentence. Keanu set his water bottle down, leaned forward just slightly and spoke, his voice quiet, measured, but carrying the weight of something David would never forget. David, I understand how the world looks from where you sit. You think value is something you can see. That worth is about what a person owns, how they dress, how they present themselves. But the truth is, the way you treat people when you think they have nothing says more about you than anything you could ever wear or own. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the flight attendants paused, pretending to adjust the service trays but clearly listening. David felt his stomach drop. His mouth went dry. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had nothing to say, because deep down he knew Keanu was right, and so did everyone else. The breaking point, David's public collapse. David's fingers tightened into fists. The humiliation, the realization, the weight of his own arrogance crashing down on him. It was too much. His pride, the thing he had built his entire identity on, was cracking, crumbling under the quiet, effortless wisdom of a man who had never once needed to prove himself. And in that moment, David snapped. He shot up from his seat so fast his champagne glass tipped over, the golden liquid spilling onto the tray table. You think you're better than me? He snapped, his voice louder than he intended. Sitting there with your little philosophy, acting like you've got it all figured out? Every head in first class turned. Keanu, still unmoved, still calm, still in complete, undeniable control. He took a slow breath and responded without a hint of anger. I don't think I'm better than you. I just don't need to prove that I belong. David's chest tightened. The words landed like a direct hit, straight into the fragile core of his self-worth. He suddenly felt very, very small. He had spent years, his entire career, chasing validation, proving to the world that he was important, that he deserved his success. And here was a man who had nothing to prove to anyone, and yet he commanded more respect in his silence than David ever could with his wealth. David sank back into his seat, his face burning, his breathing uneven. For the first time in years, he felt lost. And the worst part? Keanu hadn't even tried to humiliate him. The only person who had exposed David was David himself. The shift. A lesson that couldn't be ignored. As the flight continued, David sat in stunned silence. He could feel the stares, the weight of his own foolishness. Keanu had gone back to reading a book, as if nothing had happened, as if the moment that had just unfolded wasn't something David would think about for the rest of his life. Minutes passed, then an hour, and slowly a thought crept into David's mind, one that scared him more than anything else. What if I've been wrong about everything? What if all these years, all this ego, wealth, and power meant nothing compared to how he actually treated people? The thought refused to leave him, and for the first time, David Carter didn't feel powerful. He felt hollow, as if everything he had built was a facade he no longer believed in. And that, more than anything, terrified him. Redemption or ruin. The heavy silence after the storm. The first-class cabin remained eerily quiet. After David's outburst, no one spoke. The tension still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Keanu Reeves had returned to reading his book, as if nothing had happened. But for David Carter, everything had happened. His mind wouldn't stop spinning. The words Keanu had said kept repeating in his head, over and over again. The way you treat people when you think they have nothing says more about you than anything you could ever wear or own. It was a simple truth, a painfully obvious truth. But it felt like someone had just ripped open his chest and forced him to stare at the parts of himself he had spent years ignoring. And he didn't like what he saw. The descent into self-reflection. David slumped slightly in his seat, staring at his trembling hands. Who am I? He had always prided himself on his achievements, his status, his ability to command respect. But now, sitting next to a man who had never once needed to prove himself, David suddenly felt exposed. It wasn't Keanu's fame that made him feel this way. It was his peace, his security, his humility. David had spent his life fighting for power and validation. Keanu didn't fight for it. He just had it. Not because of money, not because of status, but because he was comfortable with who he was. And David had never once felt comfortable in his own skin. The apology that almost didn't happen. As the flight prepared for landing, David struggled with something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. The word sat on the edge of his tongue, burning, desperate to be said. He stole a glance at Keanu, still reading, still calm. It was humiliating to admit defeat. But for the first time in his life, David realized this wasn't about winning or losing. This was about becoming a better person. He took a deep breath, and finally he spoke. Keanu? The name felt foreign in his mouth, like he didn't deserve to say it. Keanu glanced over, his expression as unreadable as ever. David hesitated, swallowing hard. Then, in the quietest voice he had ever used in his life, he muttered, "I need to apologize." Keanu didn't react, waiting. David exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of his seat. "Not because of who you are, not because I just realized you're famous, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot, and—" He hesitated. The last part was the hardest to say. "And I think I've been that way for a long time." Keanu studied him for a moment, and then he smiled. Not a smirk, not pity, but a genuine, warm, knowing smile. "I appreciate that," Keanu said simply. "But more than the apology, I hope you learn from this." David nodded slowly, and the crazy thing was, he actually meant it. A lasting impression. When the plane landed, David felt different. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about how much money he made, how much power he had, or how to impress people. Instead, he was thinking about something he had never truly considered before. What kind of person am I when no one is watching? As he walked through the terminal, he saw Keanu greet fans with a smile, taking pictures, signing autographs, without a trace of arrogance. David watched from a distance. He had spent years dismissing kindness as weakness. But now he saw it for what it really was, the strongest thing in the world. Keanu disappeared into the crowd, leaving David standing alone. And in that moment, David knew he had a choice: stay the same, or change for the better. The decision for once was clear. The final thought, a lesson for all of us. Some people spend their entire lives trying to prove their worth. Others already know they have it, not because of their money, but because of their character. David had been the former, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to become the latter.